3 months ago, I discovered that the woman who gave birth to me had been lying about my entire existence, and now my brother Crispin was standing at my parents' front door, blocking my entrance to their 40th anniversary celebration like I was some unwanted stranger rather than their daughter. "Meridian, you can't come in," he said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of superiority that had grated against my nerves since childhood. Behind him, I could hear the gentle murmur of conversation, the soft clink of champagne glasses, and what sounded like my father's favorite jazz playlist drifting through the warm September evening air. I stood on the brick steps of the house where I'd grown up, holding a carefully wrapped gift and wearing the navy dress I'd bought specifically for this occasion, feeling like I was watching my life unfold from somewhere outside my own body. The irony wasn't lost on me that just 6 hours earlier, I'd been sitting in my travel agent's office, putting the finishing touches on what was supposed to be the surprise of a lifetime for our parents. "What do you mean I can't come in?" I asked, though part of me already knew where this was heading. Crispin had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes, while I was perpetually cast as the difficult daughter who asked too many questions and never quite fit the mold they'd created for me. "Look, tonight is about celebrating Mom and Dad, and honestly, you'll just create drama," he said, crossing his arms over his chest. He was wearing one of those expensive button-down shirts that our mother always complimented him on, the kind that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "This is for close family only." The words hit me like a physical blow. Close family only. As if 28 years of shared meals, birthday celebrations, Christmas mornings, and everything else that constituted our family history meant nothing. As if the daughter they'd raised, educated, and supposedly loved was somehow less family than the son they'd always favored. "Crispin, I'm their daughter," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I've been planning this night for months. I made the reservations at Bella Vista. I coordinated with the caterer. I even bought Mom those pearls she's been admiring at Hartfield's for the past year. And that's appreciated. It really is," he said, with the kind of patronizing smile that made my skin crawl. "But you know how you get when you're around extended family. You start asking uncomfortable questions, bringing up old grudges. Tonight isn't about whatever issues you think you have with us." Whatever issues I think I have. The casual dismissal of everything I'd discovered about our family, about the lies that had shaped my entire understanding of who I was, made my hands tremble with suppressed anger. But I'd learned long ago that showing emotion around Crispin only gave him more ammunition to use against me. "I see," I said quietly, taking a step back from the door. Through the window, I could see my mother in her emerald green dress, the one she'd worn to my college graduation, laughing at something my Aunt Cordelia was saying. My father stood near the fireplace, gesturing enthusiastically as he told what was probably the same story about his early days at the accounting firm that he'd told at every family gathering for the past decade. "Maybe next time, okay?" Crispin said, his tone suggesting the conversation was over. Family events work better when everyone's on the same page. I nodded slowly, understanding flooding through me with crystalline clarity. This wasn't about protecting our parents' anniversary celebration. This was about control, about maintaining the carefully constructed narrative that had kept our family functioning for decades. and I was apparently the loose thread that threatened to unravel everything. "You're absolutely right," I told him, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. Families should definitely be on the same page. He looked momentarily taken aback by my easy agreement, clearly having expected more of a fight. "Good. I'm glad you understand." "I do understand," I said, backing down the steps toward my car. "More than you know." The 20-minute drive back to my apartment passed in a blur of streetlights and half-formed thoughts. I kept the radio off, needing the silence to process what had just happened, and, more importantly, what I was going to do about it. By the time I pulled into my parking space, my mind was working with the kind of cold precision that usually emerged only when I was solving complex problems at work. I climbed the 2 flights of stairs to my small but carefully decorated apartment, kicked off the uncomfortable heels I'd worn for the celebration I'd been banned from attending, and walked directly to my desk. The travel documents were exactly where I'd left them that morning, arranged in neat folders with color-coded tabs that detailed every aspect of the surprise trip I'd been planning for my parents for the past 6 months. 2 first-class tickets to Santorini, Greece, 7 nights at the Mystique Resort, the same place where they'd spent their honeymoon 40 years ago, but had never been able to afford to return to. Private tours of the wine country, sunset dinners overlooking the caldera, couples massages at the spa, and a renewal of vows ceremony on the beach where they'd first promised to love each other forever. Total cost, $43,700. Money I'd saved by working overtime, taking on freelance projects, and living in this modest apartment instead of upgrading to something more suitable for a woman with my salary and position. Money I'd been happy to spend because I'd believed, foolishly, that family meant something. I opened my laptop and navigated to the travel agency's website, logging into my account with fingers that were surprisingly steady. The cancellation policy was clearly stated: full refund if canceled more than 72 hours before departure. The trip was scheduled to begin on Monday morning, exactly 4 days from now. The first click canceled my father's ticket. The second canceled my mother's. The confirmation emails arrived in my inbox within minutes, followed by a notification that the refund would be processed within 5 to 7 business days. Then I did something that 3 hours earlier would have seemed absolutely unthinkable. I booked myself a solo trip to Santorini using the exact same itinerary I'd planned for my parents. Same hotel, same tours, same restaurants, same sunset dinners for 1 instead of 2. If I was going to be treated like I wasn't part of the close family, then I might as well enjoy the vacation I'd essentially already paid for. The irony was delicious in its completeness. While my parents would spend the week after their anniversary at home, probably wondering why their mysterious benefactor had apparently changed their mind about the surprise trip, I'd be sipping wine on a terrace overlooking the Aegean Sea, taking the photos they would never get to take. I spent the rest of the evening packing, selecting the clothes I'd imagined my mother wearing as she explored the narrow streets of Oya, choosing the books I'd thought my father might read while lounging by the infinity pool. Every item that went into my suitcase felt like a small act of reclamation, a taking back of something that had always belonged to me, but had somehow been made conditional on other people's approval. Sunday passed quietly. I called in sick to work on Monday, which wasn't entirely untrue since the thought of sitting through meetings and pretending everything was normal made me genuinely nauseous. Instead, I went to the spa, got my hair done, and treated myself to the kind of expensive lunch I usually reserved for special occasions. By Tuesday evening, I was sitting on the terrace of my suite at the Mystique Resort, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and coral that no photograph could ever capture adequately. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant sound of waves against the volcanic cliffs and the occasional clink of glasses from other diners at the restaurant below. I'd been posting photos throughout the day, not out of any desire to make anyone jealous, but simply because the beauty of the place demanded to be shared. The infinity pool that seemed to merge with the horizon, the breakfast spread with fresh figs and local honey, the view from my private terrace that made every postcard I'd ever seen look like a pale imitation of reality. It was the sunset photo that did it. I'd captured the moment when the sun touched the water, turning the sea into liquid gold, with my glass of Assyrtiko wine perfectly positioned in the foreground, the kind of shot that travel magazines paid photographers thousands of dollars to achieve, and I'd managed it with my phone and a steady hand. I posted it to Facebook with a simple caption, "Sometimes the best company is your own. Cheers to 40 years of marriage, Mom and Dad, from Santorini with love." My phone started ringing within minutes. "Meridian? Meridian, please tell me this is some kind of joke." Crispin's voice was tight with what sounded like panic, though he was clearly trying to maintain his usual authoritative tone. "Hello, Crispin," I said, settling more comfortably into my chair and taking another sip of wine. "How was the anniversary party? I hope everyone had a wonderful time celebrating close family." "Where are you? Are you really in Greece?" "I am indeed in Greece," I confirmed, looking out at the view that was somehow even more spectacular as the last light faded from the sky. Santorini, to be specific. The Mystique Resort. Absolutely gorgeous this time of year. But when did you... He was struggling to form coherent sentences, which was unusual for my typically articulate brother. What, Crispin? When did you plan this? And why didn't you tell anyone?" I laughed, surprising myself with how genuinely amused I was by his confusion. "Oh, but I did plan to tell someone. In fact, I'd planned for months to surprise Mom and Dad with this exact trip. 40 years of marriage seemed like something worth celebrating properly, don't you think?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could practically hear the wheels turning in his head as he tried to piece together what I was telling him. "You were going to send them to Greece?" "I was going to do more than that," I said, leaning back in my chair and watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "I was going to take them to Greece. 7 nights at this very resort, wine tours, sunset dinners, couples massages, the whole romantic package. I'd saved up for months to give them the honeymoon they never got to have because they were too busy building a life and raising children. But you're there instead." "I am indeed. Funny how plans change when you're told you're not close enough family to attend your own parents' anniversary party." Another pause, longer this time. When Crispin spoke again, his voice had lost some of its earlier panic and taken on a note of something that might have been guilt. "Meridian, look, maybe I was a little harsh the other night, but you know how Mom gets when there's any kind of tension at family events." "Actually, Crispin, I don't think I do know how Mom gets," I said, swirling the wine in my glass and watching the lights begin to twinkle on the distant islands. Because until 3 months ago, I thought I knew a lot of things about our family that turned out to be complete fabrications. What are you talking about? This was the moment I'd been both dreading and anticipating since I'd boarded the plane to Athens. The moment when I would have to decide whether to keep protecting everyone else's comfort by maintaining their carefully constructed lies, or whether to finally speak the truth I'd discovered in Grandmother Evangeline's papers. I'm talking about the fact that Dad isn't my biological father, I said, the words coming out more easily than I'd expected. I'm talking about the fact that Mom had an affair with his business partner, Theodore Ashworth, and I'm the result of that affair. I'm talking about the fact that every single person in our family has known this truth for 28 years, except for me. The silence that followed was so complete, I wondered for a moment if the call had been dropped. Then I heard Crispin's sharp intake of breath, the sound of someone who'd just been blindsided by information they thought would never surface. "How did you—" he started, then stopped. "Find out?" I finished for him. Grandmother Evangeline left me some documents when she died. Birth certificates, medical records, correspondence between our parents and Theodore's lawyer regarding a financial settlement that was supposed to keep me from ever learning the truth. Very thorough documentation, actually. She always was meticulous about record keeping. "Meridian, I can explain." "Can you?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Can you explain why everyone in our family decided that I was too fragile or too stupid or too untrustworthy to know the basic facts about my own existence? Can you explain why I've spent my entire life wondering why I never quite fit in, why Dad always seemed slightly distant with me, why family photos always seemed to tell a story that didn't quite include me?" "It's complicated." "Actually, it's not complicated at all," I interrupted, surprised by how calm I felt, discussing something that had torn my world apart when I'd first discovered it. "It's quite simple. Adults made decisions based on their own convenience and comfort, and a child paid the price for those decisions her entire life. The only complicated part is how long everyone managed to maintain the charade. Look, can we talk about this when you get back? In person? This isn't the kind of conversation we should be having over the phone while you're halfway around the world." "You're absolutely right," I agreed. "This isn't the kind of conversation we should be having over the phone. It's the kind of conversation we should have had 28 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 10 years ago, or literally any time before I had to piece together my own identity from legal documents left to me by a dead woman." The terrace around me was quiet, except for the soft sound of traditional Greek music drifting up from the restaurant below. A couple at a nearby table was sharing a bottle of wine and speaking in hushed, intimate tones that reminded me of the conversations I'd imagined my parents would have been having if they were here instead of me. "Where are Mom and Dad right now?" I asked, changing the subject. They're at home. They were expecting some kind of surprise this week. Someone had told them to keep their schedule clear for a special trip, but then nothing happened. They've been confused and a little disappointed." I said, taking another sip of wine. "That does sound disappointing, to have your hopes raised like that and then dashed without explanation." "You could still give them the trip," Crispin said, his voice taking on a pleading quality I'd never heard from him before. "It's not too late. You could call the travel agent tomorrow and rebook everything." "I could," I agreed, "if I wanted to." Don't you want to? It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself since I'd made the decision to cancel their tickets. The truth was complicated and painful, and had very little to do with spite or revenge, though I was sure that's how my family would choose to interpret it. What I want, I said slowly, is to understand why everyone in my life felt entitled to make decisions about my life without including me in those decisions. What I want is to know why being related to someone apparently gives them the right to lie to you for decades and then act like you're the problem when you discover the truth. Nobody was trying to hurt you. Weren't they? I asked. Because from where I'm sitting, literally and figuratively, it seems like everyone was so invested in protecting themselves from uncomfortable conversations that they forgot to consider what their choices might be doing to me. Another pause. I could hear voices in the background on Crispin's end of the call. Probably our parents asking him what was wrong, why he looked so upset, what he was talking about so intensely. They're asking about you, he said quietly. Mom and Dad. They want to know where you are and why you haven't been answering their calls. I haven't been answering their calls because I'm trying to figure out how to have a relationship with people who've been lying to me my entire life, I said simply, and because I'm currently sitting on a terrace in Greece watching the most beautiful sunset I've ever seen and trying to remember what it feels like to make decisions based on what I want rather than what everyone else expects of me. Please, Crispin said, and there was something in his voice that I'd never heard before. Vulnerability, maybe, or genuine fear. Please don't do this to them. They love you, Meridian. We all love you. Do you? I asked. Do you love me? Or do you love the version of me that doesn't ask inconvenient questions and doesn't disrupt the comfortable fiction you've all been living with? The question hung between us like a challenge. In the distance, I could see the lights of a yacht moving slowly across the darkening sea, carrying its passengers toward destinations I could only imagine. I need to go, I said finally. I have dinner reservations and I don't want to be late. Meridian, wait. Yes? How long are you going to stay angry with us? It was such a typical Crispin question, focused on his own discomfort rather than the underlying issues that had created this situation. But it was also, in its way, an admission that he understood I had legitimate reasons to be angry. I'm not sure anger is the right word, I said, considering his question seriously. I think what I am is disappointed and confused and hurt in ways that I'm still trying to understand. But mostly, I think I'm just tired of pretending that everything is fine when it obviously isn't. So what happens now? Now I hang up the phone and go have dinner at a restaurant where I don't have to explain myself or justify my existence or pretend to be grateful for scraps of affection, I said. And tomorrow I'll take a boat tour to the volcano, and Wednesday I'll explore Oya, and Thursday I'll visit a winery, and Friday I'll have a couples massage all by myself, because apparently that's the only way I can guarantee that my plans won't be canceled at the last minute. And after that, I'll come home and figure out what kind of relationship, if any, I want to have with a family that spent my entire life treating me like an outsider while insisting that I should be grateful for the privilege. I ended the call before he could respond, turning off my phone and slipping it into my purse. The silence that followed felt profound and peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced in months. Around me, The resort continued its quiet evening rhythm, couples sharing intimate dinners, friends laughing over shared bottles of wine, solo travelers like myself finding their own forms of contentment in the simple pleasure of beautiful surroundings and excellent food. The restaurant was everything I'd hoped it would be when I had originally planned this trip for my parents. Traditional Greek dishes prepared with obvious care and artistry, local wines that paired perfectly with each course, and service that was attentive without being intrusive. I ate slowly, savoring each bite and watching the play of moonlight on the water below. At the table next to mine, an elderly couple was celebrating what appeared to be a significant anniversary. They held hands between courses, shared tastes of each other's entrees, and gazed at each other with the kind of deep contentment that comes from decades of shared experiences and mutual respect. It was exactly the scene I'd imagined my parents creating if they'd been here instead of me. The thought should have made me sad, but instead, it filled me with a strange sense of clarity. I'd spent so much of my life trying to create moments of happiness for other people, arranging celebrations and surprises and gifts that would make them smile, that I'd forgotten to pay attention to what made me happy. Sitting alone at this table, eating incredible food while looking out at one of the most beautiful views in the world, I realized I was happier than I'd been in months. My phone buzzed with text messages throughout the evening, but I ignored them all. Whatever crisis was unfolding back home could wait until I was ready to deal with it. For the first time in my adult life, I was putting my own needs and desires first, and the sense of liberation was almost overwhelming. After dinner, I walked along the resort's pathways, taking in the careful landscaping and architectural details that made this place feel like something out of a fairy tale. Other guests nodded politely as they passed, some offering friendly smiles, others clearly absorbed in their own vacation experiences. No one asked me uncomfortable questions or made me feel like I needed to justify my presence. Back in my suite, I poured myself a glass of wine from the bottle I'd brought back from dinner and stepped out onto my private terrace. The view was somehow even more spectacular at night, with the resort's subtle lighting creating a warm glow against the dramatic backdrop of the cliffs and sea. I thought about the conversation I'd had with Crispin, about the shock in his voice when I'd told him I knew the truth about my parentage. For months, I'd been wrestling with how to handle this information, whether to confront my family directly or continue pretending I didn't know. Tonight's phone call had made that decision for me. The truth was, I'd known something was different about my place in the family long before I'd found Grandmother Evangeline's documents. There had been countless small moments over the years that hadn't quite added up. Medical forms that my father seemed uncomfortable filling out, family stories that never quite included me in the same way they included Crispin, genetic traits I'd inherited that seemed to come from nowhere. But I'd always attributed these inconsistencies to my own oversensitivity, my tendency to read too much into situations that were probably perfectly normal. It had never occurred to me that my instincts were correct, that I really was different from the rest of my family in the most fundamental way possible. Finding the documents had been both devastating and oddly validating. Finally, all those years of feeling slightly out of place made sense. Finally, I understood why family gatherings always felt like performances where I was never quite sure of my lines. The revelation had also explained so much about my parents' behavior over the years. My father's well meaning but distant affection, as if he was fond of me but not quite sure how to relate to me. My mother's defensive reactions whenever I asked too many questions about family history or genetics. The way conversations sometimes stopped abruptly when I entered a room, as if I'd interrupted discussions that weren't meant for my ears. None of it had been malicious, I was sure of that. They'd all been trying to protect me from a truth they thought would be more harmful than helpful. But in their effort to spare me pain, they'd created a different kind of suffering. The constant sense that I was missing some crucial piece of information about my own life. I'd spent the past 3 months trying to decide what to do with this knowledge. Should I confront them directly? Should I pretend I'd never found the documents? Should I seek out Theodore Ashworth, my biological father, who, according to the legal correspondence, had moved to Portland after the settlement and had agreed never to contact me? The decision had been made for me when Crispin had literally blocked me from entering my parents' anniversary celebration. In that moment, standing on those familiar front steps while being told I wasn't close enough family to attend, something inside me had shifted permanently. If I wasn't close enough family to celebrate with them, then perhaps I wasn't close enough family to continue subsidizing their happiness with my own money and emotional energy. If they could exclude me from important moments, then I could exclude them from the gifts and gestures I'd always used to try to earn their love and acceptance. The phone buzzed again with another text message, but I didn't reach for it. Tomorrow would bring whatever consequences my actions had created, but tonight belonged to me. Tonight I would fall asleep to the sound of waves against volcanic cliffs, in a bed I'd paid for, with money I'd earned, in a place I'd chosen because it made me happy. Wednesday dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline light that made everything look like it had been painted by an artist with an unlimited palette. I had breakfast on my terrace, reading a book I'd been meaning to finish for months while sipping coffee that was infinitely better than anything I could make in my small apartment kitchen. The boat tour to the volcanic islands was everything the travel guides had promised and more. Our group was small and friendly, a mix of couples and solo travelers from various countries, all united by our shared awe at the dramatic landscape surrounding us. I found myself chatting easily with a retired teacher from Australia and a young couple from Germany, enjoying the kind of casual, pressure-free conversations that felt impossible in my regular life. Standing on the rim of the volcanic crater, looking down into the earth where molten rock had once created these extraordinary islands, I felt a profound sense of perspective washing over me. The problems that had seemed so overwhelming back home suddenly felt very small against the backdrop of geological time and natural beauty. I took dozens of photos throughout the day, not for social media, but for my own memory. The sulfur springs with their impossible shades of yellow and orange, the view back toward Santorini from the neighboring island of Thracia, the expression of pure joy on the face of a 7-year-old boy who was seeing the ocean for the first time. By the time we returned to the resort in the late afternoon, I felt more relaxed than I had in months. My phone showed 17 missed calls and 43 text messages, but I tucked it away without reading any of them. Whatever crisis was unfolding back home could wait until I was ready to engage with it. That evening, I had dinner at a different restaurant, this one perched on the edge of the cliff with a view that made every previous sunset I'd witnessed pale in comparison. The meal was extraordinary, but what struck me most was how comfortable I felt dining alone. Other solo travelers nodded in recognition as they passed my table, and I realized I was part of a community I'd never known existed. People who had learned that their own company could be exactly enough. Thursday brought the wine tour I'd been most looking forward to. The vineyards of Santorini were unlike anything I'd seen in travel documentaries, with vines trained into low baskets to protect them from the constant wind and volcanic soil that created wines with flavors I couldn't have imagined. Our guide was a third-generation winemaker who spoke with passionate knowledge about the island's unique terroir and the challenges of making wine in such an extreme environment. Tasting the Assyrtiko and Vinsanto wines while looking out over the vineyard toward the caldera, I understood why my parents had fallen in love with this place during their honeymoon 40 years ago. There was something almost mystical about the combination of ancient volcanic landscape, brilliant blue sea, and human ingenuity that had created beauty in such an unlikely setting. I bought several bottles to take home, though I wasn't sure yet who I might share them with. The gesture felt hopeful, in a way I wasn't ready to examine too closely. That evening, for the first time since arriving, I turned on my phone and began reading through the accumulated messages. They told a story of escalating panic and confusion that might have been funny if it hadn't involved my family's emotional distress. The early messages from my parents were puzzled and concerned. "Honey, are you okay? You missed the anniversary party, and now Crispin says you're out of the country?" And, "Meridian, please call us. We're worried about you." The later messages showed growing understanding of what had happened. "We need to talk about what Crispin told us. There are things you don't understand about the decisions we made. And please don't let old family issues ruin what should be a celebration of love and commitment." But it was the most recent message, sent just 2 hours earlier, that stopped me, cold. "Your father is in the hospital. Please come home." My hands trembled as I read the message again, then scrolled frantically through the earlier texts I'd ignored, looking for details that would explain what had happened. Between the desperate pleas from Crispin and the increasingly frantic messages from my mother, I pieced together a picture that made my stomach drop with guilt and fear. Dad had collapsed during dinner Wednesday night, a heart attack brought on by what the doctors were calling acute stress and emotional disturbance. He was stable now, but in intensive care, and according to my mother's most recent message, he'd been asking for me repeatedly since regaining consciousness. I sat on my terrace, staring at my phone screen as the sun set over the Aegean for what would be my last night in this paradise I'd created for myself. The wine from dinner tasted bitter in my mouth as I realized that my grand gesture of independence might have cost my father his life. The guilt was immediate and overwhelming. Despite everything I'd learned about my parentage, despite the lies and the exclusion and the decades of feeling like an outsider in my own family, the man lying in that hospital bed had raised me. He'd taught me to ride a bicycle, helped me with homework, walked me down the aisle at my college graduation, and loved me in the only way he knew how. The fact that his love had been complicated by knowledge I hadn't possessed didn't erase the fundamental truth that he was the only father I'd ever known. And now, while I'd been sipping wine and congratulating myself on my newfound independence, he was fighting for his life in a sterile hospital room, asking for a daughter who had chosen to be on the other side of the world. I called the airline immediately, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained my emergency and begged for the earliest possible flight home. The best they could do was a red-eye flight to Athens that would connect to a flight to New York, getting me home by Friday evening if everything went smoothly. I booked it without hesitation, using the same credit card that had paid for this trip that suddenly felt like the most selfish thing I'd ever done. Packing was a blur of folded clothes and forgotten toiletries, my hands moving automatically while my mind raced through everything I needed to say to my family when I saw them again, the apologies I owed, the explanations I'd have to give, the consequences I'd have to face for letting my anger and hurt drive me to such an extreme reaction. The taxi ride to the airport took me through the narrow streets of Fira one last time, past the whitewashed buildings and blue-domed churches that had provided such perfect peace just hours earlier. Now they felt like props in a fantasy I'd indulged while real life fell apart without me. The flight to Athens was bumpy and uncomfortable, filled with crying babies and anxious passengers, but I barely noticed. I spent the 3 hours writing and rewriting text messages to my family, trying to find words that would express my regret without making promises I wasn't sure I could keep. In the end, I sent something simple. Flying home now. We'll be there Friday evening. Tell Dad I love him. The response from my mother came immediately. Thank God. He's been waiting for you. The layover in Athens stretched endlessly. 8 hours in a sterile international terminal where every announcement and every delay felt like another barrier between me and the forgiveness I desperately hoped was still possible. I tried to sleep on the uncomfortable airport chairs, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's face the way it had looked at countless family dinners over the years, patient and kind, even when I was being difficult or demanding. He'd never been demonstrative with his affection, but he'd shown his love in other ways, working extra hours to pay for my college education, driving 6 hours to attend my graduation from business school, even though he'd had to take time off from his own work, quietly fixing things in my apartment that I'd mentioned needing repair, never making a big deal about the help he provided. The man who'd done all of those things wasn't my biological father, but he was undeniably my dad in every way that mattered. And I'd punished him for lies he'd helped tell to protect me, using knowledge he didn't know I possessed to justify behavior that was ultimately cruel, regardless of my motivation. The flight to New York was even worse than the one to Athens, turbulent and delayed, filled with mechanical problems that added 2 extra hours to an already interminable journey. I spent the time alternating between prayer to a God I wasn't sure I believed in anymore, and mental rehearsals of conversations I wasn't sure I'd have the courage to actually have. By the time I finally landed at JFK, I was exhausted, dehydrated, and running on nothing but adrenaline and guilt. The taxi ride to the hospital took another hour through Friday evening traffic, each red light feeling like a personal affront designed to keep me from reaching my family when they needed me most. The cardiac intensive care unit at St. Mary's Hospital was everything I'd expected and nothing I was prepared for. The antiseptic smell, the constant beeping of monitors, the quiet urgency of nurses moving between rooms where families waited for news that would either devastate or redeem them. I found my mother and Crispin in the small waiting area outside room 207, looking like they'd been there for days. My mother stood when she saw me, her face a mixture of relief and reproach that made my chest tighten with fresh guilt. She looked older than I'd ever seen her, exhausted in a way that went deeper than simple lack of sleep. Crispin remained seated, his expression unreadable, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the arms of his chair. "How is he?" I asked, not trusting myself to say anything more complex. "Stable," my mother said, her voice hoarse from crying. "The doctors say the next 24 hours will tell us more about potential damage to his heart. He's been sedated most of the time, but when he's conscious, he keeps asking for you." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Can I see him?" "Yes, but—" My mother hesitated, glancing at Crispin before continuing. "Meridian, we need to talk first." "About what Crispin told us. You know, about what you said on the phone, about why you left for Greece without telling anyone." I nodded, understanding that this conversation had been inevitable since the moment I discovered Grandmother Evangeline's documents. "I know. We do need to talk. But can I see Dad first? Please?" My mother's expression softened slightly. "Room 207, but only for a few minutes. He needs rest." The walk down the corridor to my father's room felt like the longest 20 steps of my life. Through the open door, I could see him lying in the hospital bed, connected to monitors and IV lines that made him look smaller and more fragile than I'd ever imagined possible. His face was pale against the white pillows, but his breathing was steady, and his eyes were open. "Dad?" I said softly, stepping into the room. He turned his head toward me, and the smile that spread across his face was so genuine, so full of relief and love, that I started crying before I could stop myself. "Meridian," he said, his voice weak but clear, "you came home." "Of course I came home," I said, moving to his bedside and taking his hand. It felt cold and thin, but his grip was stronger than I'd expected. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry for everything." "Shh," he said, squeezing my fingers. "You don't need to apologize for anything. I'm the one who owes you apologies. We all are." The tears I'd been holding back since reading about his hospitalization finally broke free. Months of anger and hurt and confusion pouring out in an ugly, cathartic sob. He let me cry, stroking my hand with his thumb the way he used to when I was little and had scraped my knee or failed a test. "I know what you found out," he said quietly when my tears had subsided enough for me to hear him. "Crispin told us about your phone call from Greece, about Grandmother Evangeline's documents." I nodded, not trusting my voice. "I should have told you myself years ago," he continued. "We all should have, but we were scared and selfish, and we convinced ourselves that protecting you from the truth was more important than giving you the choice to handle it on your own terms." Why? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Why did you keep it secret for so long? He was quiet for a moment, his eyes focused on something beyond my shoulder. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of decisions made decades earlier by younger people who couldn't have foreseen the consequences of their choices. When your mother told me she was pregnant with you, we'd been trying to have another child for 3 years, he said. The doctors had told us it probably wasn't going to happen. Then suddenly, there you were, this miracle baby we'd been praying for. He paused, gathering strength for what came next. It wasn't until after you were born that your mother told me about Theodore, about the timing that made it clear you weren't biologically mine. By then, I'd already fallen in love with you. You were already my daughter in every way that mattered to me. The idea of giving you up or treating you differently because of genetics seemed impossible. But you did treat me differently, I said, the old hurt rising despite my efforts to push it down. You and Mom both. I always felt it, even before I knew why. His face crumpled with pain that had nothing to do with his heart condition. I know. God help me. I know we did. It wasn't conscious, but I think we were always overcompensating, trying so hard to prove that the biology didn't matter that we ended up making it matter more. And Crispin knew. We told him when he turned 18. We thought he had a right to know, especially since we were asking him to keep a family secret. But we swore him to secrecy because we were still convinced that protecting you was more important than honoring your right to the truth. I thought about all the family dynamics that made sense now, all the conversations that had stopped when I entered rooms, all the medical questions that had been deflected or ignored, a lifetime of small deceptions that had added up to a fundamental dishonesty about who I was and where I came from. What about Theodore? I asked. My biological father, does he know about me? He knows you exist, my father said carefully, but we made an agreement when you were born that he wouldn't try to contact you unless you sought him out first. He respected that agreement, even though I know it wasn't easy for him. The information was a lot to process, but what struck me most was the way my father kept referring to himself as my father, never qualifying it or suggesting that biology made Theodore more legitimate in that role. Whatever mistakes had been made, whatever lies had been told, his love for me was clearly uncompromised by the circumstances of my conception. I need to ask you something, I said, gathering courage for the question that had been haunting me since Crispin had blocked me from the anniversary party. When Crispin told me I couldn't come to your celebration because it was for close family only, did you know about that? Did you agree with that decision? The confusion on his face was so genuine that I knew the answer before he spoke. He told you what? Meridian, we were expecting you that night. Your mother had set a place for you at the table. When you didn't show up, we thought something terrible had happened to you. Relief flooded through me so powerfully that I had to sit down in the bedside chair. He said I would ruin the night, that I wasn't close enough family to attend. My father's expression darkened with an anger I'd rarely seen from him. That boy has some explaining to do. Those words never came from your mother or me. You are our daughter, and you are always welcome at any celebration or gathering we host. Always. The vindication felt almost as overwhelming as the guilt had been. I hadn't been paranoid or oversensitive. Crispin really had taken it upon himself to exclude me, using his own judgment about what was best for the family rather than consulting the people whose celebration it actually was. "Dad," I said, needing to confess the full scope of what I'd done in retaliation, "I need to tell you about the trip to Greece, about why I was there instead of here when you got sick." He listened without interruption as I explained about the surprise trip I'd planned, the cancellation I'd made in anger, the decision to take the vacation myself as a form of rebellion against being excluded from my own family. His expression grew more troubled as I talked, but not in the way I'd expected. "You spent $43,000 on a surprise trip for us?" he asked when I finished. "I'd been saving for months. I wanted to give you the honeymoon you never got to have because you were too busy raising children and building a life together." Tears filled his eyes, and I realized they weren't tears of disappointment or anger, but of something much more complicated. "Meridian, that's the most generous thing anyone has ever done for us. And we lost that gift because our son decided to play gatekeeper to our own anniversary celebration." "You didn't lose it," I said quickly. "I can rebook everything. The resort, the tours, the restaurants. It might cost a little more, but I can make it happen again." He shook his head slowly. "No, sweetheart. What we lost wasn't the trip. What we lost was the chance to be surprised by our daughter's incredible generosity. What we lost was the opportunity to see your face when you gave us that gift. Those are things that can't be rebooked or rescheduled." The weight of what my anger had cost all of us settled over me like a heavy blanket. In trying to punish my family for their deceptions and exclusions, I deprived myself of the joy I would have felt seeing their reaction to the surprise I'd worked so hard to create. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm so sorry for all of it, for not being here when you got sick, for letting my hurt feelings matter more than your health, for being so angry about the past that I forgot about the present. And I'm sorry for giving you reasons to be angry," he replied. "I'm sorry for the lies, for the distance, for not trusting you with the truth about your own life. Most of all, I'm sorry that my fear of losing you led to choices that made you feel like you didn't fully belong in this family." A nurse appeared in the doorway, checking her watch with the kind of professional authority that brooked no argument. "Visiting hours are ending soon, and Mr. Tremaine needs his rest." I stood to leave, but my father held on to my hand. "Will you come back tomorrow? There's more we need to talk about, and I want your mother and Crispin to be part of the conversation." "Of course," I said, leaning down to kiss his forehead. "I'll be here as long as you want me to be." "I'll always want you to be here," he said simply. "You're my daughter, Meridian. Biology doesn't change that. Secrets don't change that. Geography doesn't change that. Nothing changes that." The conversation with my mother and Crispin happened the next morning in the hospital cafeteria, over coffee that tasted like bitter water and pastries that none of us had any appetite for. The three of us sat around a small table that felt simultaneously too big and too small for the weight of what we needed to discuss. My mother looked better after a night of sleep, but there were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there a week ago, and her usually perfect composure was frayed around the edges. Crispin appeared genuinely contrite for the first time since I'd known him. his usual confidence replaced by something that looked remarkably like shame. "I owe you an apology," he said, before either my mother or I could speak. "What I said to you at the anniversary party was unforgivable. I had no right to exclude you, and no right to speak for Mom and Dad about who was welcome at their celebration." "Why did you do it?" I asked, genuinely curious rather than accusatory. "What made you think it was your decision to make?" He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture that reminded me of countless childhood moments when he'd been caught doing something he knew was wrong. "I thought I was protecting them. When you called me a few weeks before the party and started asking questions about family medical history and genetics, I panicked. I thought you'd figured out about Theodore, and I was terrified you were going to cause a scene at the anniversary party." "So you decided to cause a scene instead?" "I decided to prevent what I thought would be a bigger scene," he said miserably. "I was wrong about everything. Wrong about your motivations, wrong about my authority to make that decision, wrong about what was best for everyone involved." My mother reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. "Crispin told us about the questions you'd been asking, but we didn't know you'd actually found documents. We thought you were just being curious about family history the way people sometimes are as they get older." "I found more than documents," I said quietly. "I found birth certificates, correspondence between you and Theodore's lawyer, financial records showing a settlement payment. Grandmother Evangeline kept everything." My mother's face went pale. "Your grandmother knew?" "She knew, and she understood that someday I'd need to know too. She left everything to me with a letter, explaining that she couldn't bear to watch me spend my whole life wondering why I felt different from the rest of the family." Silence fell over our table as my mother and Crispin absorbed this information. Around us, the cafeteria buzzed with the quiet conversations of other families dealing with their own crises, their own difficult truths, their own attempts to find healing amid the sterile environment of a hospital. "What do you want to know?" my mother asked finally. "About Theodore? About the affair? About the decisions we made afterward?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself since discovering the truth. What did I want to know? How much detail would actually help me understand my place in the family versus how much would simply satisfy a curiosity that might be better left unsatisfied? "I want to know if you loved him," I said, surprising myself with the directness of the question. My mother was quiet for a long moment, her eyes focused on her untouched coffee. When she spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "I did love him, not the way I loved your father, but in a different way that felt overwhelming at the time. Theodore was charming and exciting and represented a kind of life that felt dangerous and irresistible to a woman who'd been married for 15 years and was struggling with the disappointment of infertility." She looked up at me then, her eyes filled with the kind of raw honesty I'd rarely seen from her. "It was a mistake, but you weren't a mistake. You were the best thing that came out of a situation that hurt everyone involved." "Does Dad really forgive you? For the affair? For the deception? For everything?" "Your father is a better man than I deserved," she said simply. "He forgave me because he chose to prioritize our family over his hurt feelings. He helped create the lie about your parentage because he believed protecting you was more important than protecting his own pride. And now? Now we're all older and hopefully wiser, and we understand that the lies we told to protect you ended up hurting you in different ways. We can't undo the choices we made, but we can choose to be honest going forward." Crispin cleared his throat, drawing our attention back to him. "There's something else I need to tell you," he said, his voice heavy with reluctance. "About the things I said to you over the years, about the way I sometimes treated you like you were being oversensitive or dramatic when you complained about feeling left out." I waited, sensing that whatever was coming would be important. "I knew you were right," he admitted. "I could see that Mom and Dad treated us differently, and I could see that it hurt you. But instead of standing up for you or encouraging them to tell you the truth, I used my knowledge of the situation to make myself feel superior. I told myself you were being paranoid when I knew you were actually being perceptive." The admission hit me harder than I'd expected. Why? Because it was easier to let you think you were imagining things than to risk the family stability I benefited from? Because I was selfish and immature and more concerned with maintaining my position as the favored child than with protecting my sister from unnecessary pain. His honesty was brutal and complete, leaving no room for the comfortable rationalizations that had probably sustained him for years. I found myself feeling something unexpected: respect for his willingness to own his mistakes without qualification or excuse. "What happens now?" I asked, echoing the question he'd posed to me during our phone call from Greece. "Where do we go from here?" "That depends on what you want," my mother said, "on what kind of relationship you want to have with us, knowing what you now know about our family history." It was a question I'd been wrestling with for months, and the answer was more complicated than any of them probably wanted to hear. I loved them, but I didn't trust them. I wanted to rebuild our relationships, but I wasn't sure I could do it on the same terms that had existed before. I forgave them for their mistakes, but I needed them to earn back my confidence in their judgment and honesty. "I want to start over," I said finally, "not by pretending the past didn't happen, but by building something new based on truth instead of convenient fictions. I want to meet Theodore if he's willing. I want to understand my complete medical history. I want family gatherings where I don't have to wonder what conversations are happening behind my back. And I want us to be equals," I continued, looking directly at Crispin. "No more decisions made about my life without including me. No more assumptions about what I can or can't handle. No more treating me like the difficult daughter who needs to be managed rather than the adult woman who deserves respect." "That's fair," my mother said immediately. "More than fair, considering what we've put you through." "But it's going to take time," I warned them. "Trust isn't something that can be rebuilt overnight, especially when it's been broken by decades of systematic deception. I'm willing to work toward forgiveness and reconciliation, but I need you to understand that the process will happen on my timeline, not yours." "Whatever you need," Crispin said, "however long it takes." Over the following weeks, as my father recovered from his heart attack and returned home to begin the process of cardiac rehabilitation, our family began the much more complex process of learning how to be honest with each other. It was harder than any of us had anticipated, requiring constant vigilance against old patterns of communication and decision-making. My mother scheduled an appointment with Theodore Ashworth, my biological father, arranging a meeting that felt simultaneously momentous and strangely anticlimactic. He turned out to be a quiet, thoughtful man in his early 60s who had spent 28 years wondering about the daughter he'd never been allowed to know. Our first conversation was awkward and careful, both of us trying to navigate the strange territory of a relationship that had enormous biological significance, but no shared history or emotional foundation. He answered my questions about family medical history with the thoroughness of someone who had been preparing for this conversation for decades. He showed me photographs of his parents, my biological grandparents, and pointed out family resemblances I'd never understood before. But perhaps most importantly, he made it clear that he had no intention of trying to replace the man who had raised me or to insert himself into my life in ways that would create additional complications for a family that was already struggling to find its equilibrium. "I'm grateful to know you," he told me as our first meeting was ending. "But I understand that I'm a stranger to you, and I don't expect that to change quickly or easily. I'm here if you want to build a relationship, and I'll respect your boundaries if you decide that's not something you're interested in pursuing." His respect for my autonomy and his understanding of the complex dynamics involved made it easier for me to imagine a future that might include some form of relationship with him, though I knew it would take time to determine what that relationship might look like. Meanwhile, Crispin was working to rebuild trust with concrete actions rather than just words. He called me before making any family plans that might affect me. He asked for my input on decisions about our parents' care and well-being. He stopped making assumptions about my availability or my preferences, treating me instead like an adult family member whose opinions and schedules mattered. The changes were small but significant, representing a fundamental shift in how our family operated. Instead of a hierarchy with my parents at the top, Crispin in the middle, and me at the bottom, we were learning to function as a group of adults who cared about each other but respected each other's independence and autonomy. The process wasn't always smooth. There were moments when old patterns reasserted themselves, when someone made an assumption or excluded someone from a decision out of habit rather than malice. But now, we had a framework for addressing these lapses instead of letting them fester into larger resentments. Most surprisingly, the crisis had brought me closer to my father than we'd ever been before. His heart attack had forced all of us to confront the possibility of loss, and that confrontation had stripped away the polite distance that had characterized our relationship for so many years. He began telling me stories about his own childhood, his struggles with his demanding father, his fears about marriage and parenthood that had made him sometimes emotionally unavailable, even when he wanted to be present. He talked about the impossible position he'd felt caught in after learning about my true parentage, loving me completely while feeling like he had no right to claim me fully. "I was always afraid that if you knew the truth, you'd want to find your real father and leave us behind," he admitted during one of our longer conversations. "It was selfish, but the thought of losing you was unbearable." "You're my real father," I told him, meaning it completely. "Biology doesn't determine that. Love does. Commitment does. The choice to show up every day for 18 years and teach a child how to be a decent human being, that's what makes someone a real father." 6 months after my return from Greece, we finally took the trip I'd originally planned for my parents' anniversary. All 4 of us went together. plus Theodore, who had gradually become a presence in our family gatherings without disrupting the fundamental relationships that had always defined us. Sitting on the terrace at the Mystique Resort, watching the same sunset I'd witnessed alone during my angry exile, I reflected on how different this moment felt from that earlier experience. The view was just as spectacular, the wine just as excellent, but everything else had changed. Instead of the bitter satisfaction of enjoying paradise in defiant solitude, I felt the deeper contentment that comes from sharing beauty with people you love, even when those relationships are complicated and imperfect. Instead of using my presence in this place as a weapon against my family, I was using it as a gift to celebrate the hard work we'd all done to rebuild our connections on a foundation of honesty rather than convenience. My father raised his glass as the sun touched the horizon, proposing a toast that seemed to sum up everything we'd learned about forgiveness and second chances, and the possibility of healing even the deepest wounds. To families, he said, his voice strong and clear, to the ones we're born into, the ones we create, and the ones we choose to rebuild when we're brave enough to tell each other the truth. We clinked glasses as the sky turned gold and coral and deep purple. 5 adults who had learned that love could survive deception, that trust could be rebuilt after betrayal, and that sometimes the most painful truths were also the most necessary ones. The photos from that trip sit framed on my mantle now, visible reminders of what became possible when we stopped protecting each other from difficult realities and started trusting each other to handle whatever truth our family story contained. They remind me that the worst thing that happened to me, being excluded from my own family's celebration, led directly to the best thing, a family rebuilt on honesty, respect, and the kind of love that doesn't require perfect understanding to flourish.